Questionnaires and surveys. So typically the questions that you'll get to do with this topic focus on either avoiding or detecting the common mistakes that people make when they put together a questionnaire or a survey. So what are those common mistakes? Here are some of the key ones that come up frequently. So one of the key ones is the fact that the time period of the question is not specified. We'll go into all of these when we look at some examples so you understand them better. That not all the possible options are covered by the response boxes that have been given. Sometimes the problem is that the response boxes overlap, and so somebody filling in that questionnaire wouldn't know which box to tick perhaps. Another way in which we can make mistakes with questionnaires is to use what's biased wording. So phrase the question in a way so that we show that we favour one opinion over another. And then another way in which things can go wrong is in terms of how we actually collect that data. So again, there could be bias in terms of that. So for example, typical things like if you want to find out about how often on average people go to the gym, if you go and stand outside the gym to ask that question, you're going to get a biased result to your questionnaire, because of course predominantly the people you're going to be catching when you stand in there are people who do actually go to a gym on a regular basis, and those people who don't won't usually be found walking past there, so you won't get a truly representative picture of what's going on. So those are some of the common mistakes. Now let's look at some examples to illustrate some of those here. So in this top question here, it says George wants to find out how much money people spend on DVDs. And here's the question he uses. How much do you spend on DVDs? And then he's got response boxes here that go from £5 to £10, the first one, 10 to 30, the second one, 30 to 50 is the next one, and over 50 is the last one. And then here they ask us to write down 2 criticisms of his question. I can actually see 3, so we'll talk about all 3. So the first one is, the question says, how much do you spend on DVDs? So this is an example of where the time period has not been specified. So I could answer that question and think about how much do I spend on DVDs in a year? And that might be how I answer that question. Whereas another person might read that and they might buy a lot more DVDs than I do, so they may interpret that as how much do you spend on DVDs every month. Clearly, if we both give our answers, you're not going to have data that you can compare like with like, because if it's different time periods we're talking about, it's not really a true reflection of what people's habits are in terms of spending on DVDs. Okay, so down here typically it also asks us to write a better version. So the first of the criticisms I've got is that the time period is not specified. Now I haven't got room to do this here, but if I was doing this for the exam, I would go on to explain that a little bit more. Something like it doesn't say over what time period do I need to collect the data on the DVDs. So if we're going to design a better version of that question, it would be, how much do you spend on DVDs every month? Okay, you could have said every week, could have said every year, but every month is what I've gone for. Okay, so that's the first thing that's a problem there. Now the next major issue is the fact that the response boxes don't start till you get to £5. So that means people who don't buy DVDs aren't covered by those options, or people who buy spend less than £5 are not covered. So the second problem here is that not all options are covered. And again, if I was doing this in the exam, I would then go on to explain, as I've just done, that it doesn't cover people who don't buy DVDs or buy less than £5 worth of DVDs. Okay, so we've got to make sure that every possible answer is covered. So if we were going to fix this down here, I haven't really got space to put them all in, we'd need another little box above that one saying at very least 0 to 5. Now technically there is a third problem here, and that third problem is that they actually do have overlapping response boxes. So for example, the first one that they gave was 5 to 10 and the next one says 10 to 30. So if I spend exactly £10, which of those two boxes should I tick? Okay, so it's quite difficult to fix that problem without using notation. So one of the ways that we could do that is to say £5 less than, let's see, what shall we use? I'll just use D for DVDs. So we're using this interval notation, this inequality notation. So this now says that this category is anything over £5 but up to and including £10. And then the next one down you would start in the same way, so that wouldn't include 10, but it would go up to and include the 30 and so on. So that's one way you can tackle it. Sometimes another way you can tackle it is by saying rounded to the nearest whatever, but technically you shouldn't be having the end of one response box category being the beginning of the next one if you don't use the proper notation. Okay, you didn't need to give all three of those reasons, but we did need to give at least two. So the first two were probably the most glaringly obvious, the lack of a time period and that not all the options are covered. Okay, so final part of the question down here says that George asks 10 people in his class, and it asks us then to explain why his sample will be biased. So this comes back to this mistake of a biased method of collecting the data. So if he's only asking people in his class, well, they're all similar people. They're all of the same age and the same sort of in that respect. And so, you know, the buying habits of people who are much older or children would be completely different. And so if you're technically trying to answer this question, which was how much money people spend on DVDs and not how much people in my class spend on DVDs, then he's not really going to cover that. If he wants a truly representative sample, then he needs to have people from all different age groups, backgrounds, that sort of thing, to make sure that his sample is not biased. Okay, let's look at another example. So Aidan wants to find out people's opinions on a new road being built. And here's the question. It says, a new road will cause a lot of traffic for the village. Don't you agree? And then it says, yes, maybe, unsure. So again, we're asked to write down 2 things that are wrong with this question. So this is an example, first of all, of biased wording, because clearly Aidan thinks that the new road is not a good idea. And even if that's how you feel, that's not how you should design your questionnaire. If you want to get proper information, you must be neutral in the way that you write that. So the first problem we have here is biased wording of the question. Okay, so if we want to find out about people's response to this topic, so we need to find out a better question for Aidan's questionnaire to find out if people wanted a new road to be built. Okay, so very simply it could be, do you want the new road to be built? So there's no leaning towards yes or no in the way that I phrased that question. Okay, so now let's go back and look up here. So the other problem that we've got here is kind of twofold again. So first of all, not all the options are covered. Because it says yes, maybe, unsure. It doesn't say no. There's no box. So they haven't covered all the options. But probably what they're looking for you more likely to actually pick up on it here is the fact that maybe and unsure are really 2 ways of saying the same thing. So what we've got there, if you like, is overlapping, or actually maybe a better word this time would be duplicate response boxes. You might argue that they're overlapping in a certain way and that they're not quite the same thing, but they're more or less saying the same thing. So if we want to design our own new one, we'd have yes, no, haven't decided, perhaps. Could be a way of phrasing those, or you could go with the unsure or the maybe word, one or the other, but not both, obviously. So we want a simple yes, no, and an option for those who haven't made up their mind yet. Okay, so one more example. So this is the manager of a cinema wants to find out how often people go to the cinema. So it says, how often do you go to the cinema a month? So they've avoided that time period issue, so that's good. Now, let's look at their response boxes. They've got a lot, often, many times. So what problems do we have here? So first of all, we've got a problem because a lot and many times pretty much are the same thing, aren't they? So in a sense, we've got that duplicate or overlapping response box issue. But the other thing is that this is a bit vague and open to interpretation as well. So what I would consider going to the cinema a lot might not be what somebody else considers a lot. So for me, I don't go very often. So going a lot might be going twice, whereas for other people, they may go at least every week, and so going twice wouldn't be a lot. So instead of having a lot or often or many times, what we need to do is actually quantify that. So we can keep the question, how often do you go to the cinema a month? That's fine. It's the response boxes that we need to change. So I'm not going to write the question again. So So we need to cover sort of, in the first one, I'm going to say 0 to 1 times a month. Then in the next one, let's say 2 to 4. And then maybe the last one will make 5 or more. Okay, you want to give them at least 3 response boxes. Okay, so these are much more easy for everybody to answer. You know which one of those it is that you tick. And when it comes to interpreting the data, we can be very clear about what information we've been given. Okay. In this circumstance, sometimes this would actually indicate that we were missing something, because what if it was 1.5? But there's no such thing as going to the cinema 1.5 times. This is discrete data, so that's not a problem. Could be a problem if we're dealing with continuous data. So those are the common pitfalls that people make with questionnaires.